Admiral Mike Rogers, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So far on the show, Admiral, we've been talking in part about the deep fakes that are becoming a part of this election campaign, these false allegations against Vice Presidential nominee Tim Walz. I mean, those things, clearly fakes, look kind of ridiculous. Do those things, do you think, have a significant impact on the race, or are the cyber threats, the kind of misinformation or disinformation that's flying around, come in different forms?
I mean, I think the reality is you just don't know. I mean, we don't have an empirical, and I've been testifying before Congress, I've been asked the same question, and my answer was, look, the reality is, number one, we just don't know. I also think it's reflective of a society that in many ways is just becoming numb to this kind of activity. There's just so many uses of technology to make these really wild and distorted allegations or perceptions that, you know, I'm not sure how much it really affects individuals. It's unfortunate that it's happening. Don't get me wrong. No one should have to go through this kind of thing.
As this progresses, this foreign misinformation, let's say it gets bigger and gets more sophisticated as it goes on. How does it compare, though, to the domestic misinformation? Is it just swamped by the domestic information, or is foreign misinformation a genuine concern compared to the domestic misinformation?
So first, I think you make a very important point. There's a domestic component to this as well as an international component of this. The international component tends to get a lot of attention, if you will. The domestic component is growing. You know, that's a sad comment in some ways, but it's a view that, from many people's opinion, and hey, this can be used to manipulate opinion, to potentially change outcomes, to maybe drive perceptions. Unfortunately, it's increasing in both segments. You're seeing both domestic increases of this, but you're also seeing international actors, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. They believe that it clearly is having some measure of effect. Don't know if that's true or not, but they seem to be upping the game. This doesn't seem to be decreasing.
US intelligence agencies, Admiral, have assessed that Russia is once again actively involved in trying to promote President Trump, to try and do what they can to get him re-elected. You were there in 2016.
In 2016, yes.
When this happened for the first time. What are your enduring memories of that time? How concerned were you? And also the concern that a lot of people had when it seemed as though Donald Trump and his campaign were more than playing footsie with Russia. They were saying, help us out if you want to. WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks. You're on the inside then. When you're hearing that stuff, what are you thinking?
So first, I thought one of the challenges was we had not seen this level of interference from the Russians before. It wasn't that we hadn't seen the Russians attempt to influence perception or to change people's perceptions or to attempt to divide our nation. That is not something that is new. What was different in 2016 was the scale and the use of social media. We just had never seen it on such a huge scale, and that social media had become such a significant component of the Russian strategy. That was somewhat new. So I can remember both talking to President Obama as we're briefing him on, hey, here's what we've seen, sir. Then the discussion about, okay, so what should we communicate to the Russians and how should we do it? Should we do it publicly? Should we do it quietly, if you will, directly? The decision at the time, I remember this in September of 16, was ultimately made. It happened to be that President Obama was going to be interacting with Putin, and so the decision was made, hey, they're going to have a conversation about it. And the basis of the conversation was, Vladimir, we know exactly what you're doing. We have awareness of this. You really need to stop this, both because it's not going to be effective because we have an awareness of it. But secondly, if you continue to do this, we are prepared to take action. The reality was then that conversation from memory occurs towards the end of September of 16. As we approach the election in November, the Russians aren't backing off. We continue to see the same level of effort. And I remember thinking back on that, we should have been, I'll only speak for myself, I wish we had been more public, more aggressive about not just naming and shaming, but talking about what we were going to do. It was only after the election that we then implemented a series of sanctions. For example, we shut down a couple Russian facilities and we deported, if you will, a handful of Russian diplomats to say, look, in response to your activity, we're going to reduce your footprint in the United States. And then I can remember going to, President Obama had directed the then director of national intelligence, Jim Clapper, the director of the CIA, John Brennan, myself as the director of NSA, and Jim Comey, the director of the FBI, put together a single integrated report that uses every source that we have that outlines in a kind of comprehensive way, here's what happened, here's what's their strategy, this is what they did. His view was, President Obama, hey, look, I want to turn this over and I want to make sure that my incoming successor has an awareness of this, because I think this is very important. So I can then remember after the briefing, in a place like this, in the Oval Office with President Obama, he then directed the four of us to go up to New York, to Trump Tower, to physically talk to President-elect Trump at the time. And that was an interesting, conversation, because I always thought his concern was, are you implying, by saying that the Russians are attempting to influence, are you implying either the fact that I won was due to some external factor other than the fact that a majority of Americans believed in me and preferred me to Hillary Clinton being the other candidate? Or are you implying by this that somehow I am controlled, influenced by the Russians, or they have some sort of handle over me? He was very sensitive about that. And we said, sir, that's not what we're saying. But
Can I ask, this is 8 years later, so maybe you can reveal these kinds of things. When you're talking about actions you could take against the Russians, or what kind of actions can you possibly take at the time, not 6 months later, at the time to convince them to not undertake these kinds of measures?
So you could look at a spectrum of things, from things that are very visible, like sanctions, from things that are not so visible, like, hey, we can use cyber against you as a way to... we could use cyber against you as a way to make sure you understand we have capability that we can use that you're not going to like. We can have an impact on you that is going to be painful. And oh, by the way, if you're going to continue to do these things, guess what? We're going to react, and you don't want to go down this path. So there's a spectrum of things that you can do. And I will say in 2020, 4 years later, the next election cycle for us, we used the lessons from 2016, and we were both much more focused on the topic of election security, and we were much more aggressive in dealing with the Russians in the buildup to the November 2020 election. And we did some interesting things with them. I won't go into detail, but we did some very interesting things with them, which seemed to be effective in the sense that we did not see the same level of effort in 2020 that we saw in 2016.
This may be a question you can't answer, Admiral, but are there areas of vulnerability in 2024 that worry you that you are able to speak about?
So first of all, if you're looking at our election sequence, the thing for people to understand is, number one, elections are a state and a local operation. In our system, the federal government does not do elections. It certifies election outcomes for the presidency, for example, with the Electoral College, but it doesn't execute them. As a result, every state does it slightly differently. Some use an automated system, some use totally pen and paper. The positive side from a cybersecurity perspective is it's not a single integrated, all connected system. It's a series of stovepipe fragmented systems. That makes it more difficult to achieve a cyber effect. And when we say, use cyber to tamper with or influence elections, do you go after the ability to actually cast a vote, i.e. when you're in the voting booth? Do you go after the information underpinnings like voter registration rolls? The way you vote in the United States, you have to be registered to vote. You show up at the poll, you show them an identification form. They then compare that form of ID with the voting roll, and if it matches, you're now cleared to vote. So if you manipulate the voting rolls, for example, you can preclude people from being able to vote. You could potentially create false identities. Again, we never saw that. And then we also, so in 2016, for example, we saw the Russians go after campaigns. They physically were penetrating both the Democrat and the Republican campaigns. A little unequal in terms of the effectiveness, but there's a lot of components to this. Is the only point I would make. It's not, hey, all you have to do is this, and you can impact the outcome of an election. That's not really true in our system.
We often talk about, with misinformation, that the aim is not necessarily to convince people of any particular course, so much as to just confuse people.
And to keep us divided.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask, what is the end point there for a country like Russia? Why does Russia care if America is divided?
So, look, a divided America, if you're the Russians, a divided America is less focused on the broader world around it, is less quick to deal with that broader world, is often unable to generate consensus about, well, what is the best way to deal with some of these situations? I think from a Russian perspective, the value is it gives them time, it potentially gives them some freedom of maneuver, and it slows us down. I think that's the advantage from their perspective, if you will.
Admiral, in recent weeks we've heard from the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and in recent days from another former four-star general, former Chief of Staff to President Trump, John Kelly, both essentially saying in their assessment Donald Trump is, in the case of Milley, fascist to the core. In the case of Kelly meets the general definition of fascist, certainly authoritarian, dictatorial tendencies. Both quite damning, given that these are two military men who, as well as swearing an oath to the Constitution, there's an unwritten oath that you do not get involved in politics, certainly not partisan politics. How significant are those comments and what do you make of them? Do you concur with them?
So, first of all, every American citizen, regardless of whether you're in the military or not in the military, everyone is entitled to their opinion and their political views. That's one of our rights. It's a strength of our nation, I believe. I am a proponent of when we're in uniform and when we're retired as senior military. I'm a good example. You didn't say to me when we first met each other, I'd like you to meet Mike Rogers. You said, I'd like you to meet Admiral Mike Rogers. You just never, when you're a senior, like a 4-star, you don't ever walk away from that. So I always felt strongly when I was in the military, and now that I'm retired, that I can best serve the nation that I support and I believe in, my own country, by not inserting myself into the political process, by not voicing opinions I might have. My view is, look, I will exercise my right by my vote. I will exercise my right by how I use money and what I could choose to contribute to or not to contribute to. I will display my opinion by the way I spend my time and who I choose to support. I am not, I only speak for myself, I am not going to spend my time making statements or characterizations about any politician, even though in this case, John and Mark, friends, we've known each other, we served together. All three of us worked for President Trump when he was the President of the United States. I have worked with then Senator, then Senator Harris, who was in the Oversight Committee in the Senate, responsible for oversight of the National Security Agency. So I've spent plenty of time with her, sometimes one-on-one, discussing different issues, but I just am not going to get into this characterization, in part because my view is, if you're not careful, this politicizes the military. And one of the reasons why the military has been effective in many ways, in my opinion, is the fact that our society views us as, you guys don't take sides. You serve the nation to the best of your ability, and you remain true to the oath that you took to defend the Constitution. You don't get involved in politics, you don't...
Are Kelly and Millie wrong, therefore? Or
no, I'm not going to say wrong. I'm going to say they have the right to exercise their view. It's not my particular approach, and it's not the way I choose to do it. But I do acknowledge everyone has that right.
Okay, so given that you're trying very hard to stay neutral, you might not answer this next question, but I'll try.
Stay impartial. The way I do it is I'm trying to stay impartial. Okay.
Having worked with Obama, under Obama, right, under Trump, and with Kamala Harris, they all will presumably have different styles. I'm not asking you to...
Three very dissimilar individuals.
Well, exactly. I'm not asking you to criticize any of them or to compliment any of them, but how would you describe the difference in working under them or with them?
So President Obama, by background, a constitutional lawyer, a community activist before he became a senator. We're both from Illinois. He was very much, he rapidly assimilated information, often in the written form. So when you brief the president, you always provide a written package to the president in advance, normally 24 to 48 hours. I never had an interaction with him where he had not read all the briefing material. And he would literally walk in and say, okay, Mike, I've read the material. Here's the 4 things I want us to focus on. He was always well prepared. He was always, I found him to be a very strong leader. He cared very much about team and the idea of loyalty to the mission, loyalty to each other. On the other hand, there was always a bit of a wall. You never got to Barack Obama, the individual. And that's not a criticism, it's just an observation. You just didn't get it. I used to kid him, we're both from Chicago. I used to kid him about sports. I was a North Side guy, so I'm a Chicago Cubs baseball fan. He was a South Side guy, so he's a Chicago White Sox fan. But you just never got through that barrier. President Trump, on the other hand, when you first met him, he's almost gregarious. Tall, large, walks up to you, gives you a big handshake. He would oftentimes slap me on the back, punch me in the shoulder. He's a bit of a Hale and Hardy kind of guy. He had no knowledge or experience in government, had never served in politics, never served in Washington. So his incoming bias was, I'm a business guy. What does that mean? I care about outcomes. I'm not focused on process. And I believe that we need to make decisions more quickly. So I had never met a guy who was willing to make such significant decisions so quickly. President Obama, for example, loved consensus. He often would tell us, I'll take the time it gets for us to come together with a kind of consensus recommendation to me. President Trump, very different, was very much, okay, I don't want the 20 years of background on this issue, so tell me what the issue is, tell me what the recommendation is, and what are you looking for me to do? He was always like this, always very quick. On the other hand, he had a different view of loyalty in some ways. His experience had been as a chief executive officer. He had never been the president of the United States or served in politics. So he very much felt, hey, look, in essence, I am the CEO of the nation. So I want you to have the same loyalty to me that I would expect as a business CEO. And, as a military guy, you're trying to, well, sir, the oath that I take is to the Constitution. It's not to an administration. It's not to an individual. So at times, I think President Trump found that a little frustrating. It was different from his experience. Senator Harris, the thing that I was always struck by her, she was a prosecutor. So when you dealt with her, she could rapidly assimilate a lot of information. She was always well prepared on the issue, and she always wanted to ask you questions. She preferred yes or no answers, and she wanted to drive you to a conclusion that she already had. She very much was like a prosecutor who in a court case is, look, I am trying to evoke a set of answers that will create a verdict in the mind of the judge or the jury. I'm not interested necessarily in all the background. She was very much, hey, let's stay focused, let's get to the answer, which can be challenging if you're sitting there in a Senate hearing and you're trying to say, well, it's not yes or no and it's not black or white. This is a complicated issue with many dimensions. And you're being told, Admiral, I'm looking for a yes or no here. That can be a challenge sometimes, but a very intelligent individual. And she was clearly very committed to her job. I mean, she really prepared. I never saw her not prepared in our interactions.
Can I ask you, Admiral, about President Trump's notions of loyalty? Famously, Jim Comey was deeply disturbed by a kind of a request from Trump that he pledge his personal fealty to President Trump. It's come up a number of times in the critiques from both Milley and Kelly as well, that Trump does not see your loyalty as being to the Constitution of the United States, but to him personally. Given the influence of those who advise him and the speed with which you describe Trump makes his recommendations, his decisions on big things, that would suggest that the people around him in a potential second term are going to be hugely influential and hugely important if he's demanding loyalty from them rather than from them to the Constitution. That sounds like a potentially dangerous combination.
Well, look, everyone's experience is different. I found in my interactions with him, I was always very direct. You've heard this characterization that he likes strength. I found if you stood up to him, so to speak, and you told him what you thought, not what he wanted to hear, that you could generate some level of respect out of him. For example, I'm in the Mueller report. I'm the only active duty military individual in the Mueller report, which was the investigation of the Russian influence efforts in 2016, in part because twice he asked me to do something, President Trump, and I said, sir, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not going to do that. Here is why. Here's why I don't think this is appropriate. But I acknowledge as I'm doing that, I'm mentally thinking to myself, if the president doesn't agree, he's always got the right to fire me. But my view was, I'm not going to do something because that's what the chief executive wants. I'm going to provide him an input that I think reflects the truth and the reality as I perceive it, recognizing that he may have a different opinion and may come to a different conclusion. The other point I always try to make is remember, as an intelligence professional, my view is I'm not the one who's here to hold him accountable. That's what the citizens of this nation will do. We do that in the form of an election every 4 years. We do that through mechanisms like impeachment. We do that through mechanisms like the court system. My view is, guys, everybody needs to do their job and stick to their roles. And at times, I thought one of our challenges was some people around him. And you see this, one read I would recommend to you, H.R. McMaster, a retired Lieutenant General of the United States Army, a guy I had the pleasure, we've known each other a long time, was Trump's second national security advisor. He has just written a book in which he talks about this kind of challenge about, okay, so you're an advisor around him, and are you trying to tee up recommendations or that reflect both his concerns as well as the things he's trying to achieve? Or do you say to yourself, hey, I don't think that's right. I have real concerns about it, and I'm going to try to impede this in some way. My view is, guys, every one of us gets paid to do our jobs. My job is not to decide for the President of the United States what is right or wrong. My job is to provide an input to the President so he can make the best policy choices And as a military, we can make the best military choices. If those choices are inappropriate, he'll be held accountable. The metric I used was, if it's illegal, I'm not going to do it. If it's immoral, unethical, I'm not going to do it. But if it's something that I just don't agree with or I don't like, I acknowledge he is the duly elected President of the United States, and that's our roles. Everybody needs to do our role.
We've asked you about misinformation because that's in the news at the moment.
Yeah.
But what is the actual greatest concerns facing the NSA today? Does misinformation rate at all in their pantheon of concerns?
I mean, it does. Look, what I used to tell when I would be asked by Congress and I'd be asked by the president, Mike, what do you think are our greatest concerns or greatest issues? The one that always concerned me the most was the fact that in an open democratic society, how do we deal with the fact that adversaries externally, actors internally, are using our very freedoms combined with advanced technology to actually turn this idea of free speech, broad spreading of opinions, they're actually trying to turn that against us. I thought that is our greatest challenge, because the attempts to try to deal with it, they start to get you out of your comfort zone. Hey, what's the role of government? Should government do some sort of censorship, some sort of control? What's the role of the private sector that runs those platforms, that runs those social media outlets? What responsibility do they have? Those are interesting questions that traditionally we haven't had to deal with very much, but that's the reality of the world we're dealing with now. That probably was always the greatest concern, because the byproduct of all that effort, it fuels this division. It fuels this inability of our nation to come to a consensus, to come together. What you always hope, and the American experience has always been, we may disagree with each other on an average daily basis, but when we come to a crisis, when we come to a significant issue, think 9/11, et cetera, we come together and we lower our disagreements and we focus on what we can do collectively to achieve a better outcome. That's the strength of America. Now, I will say the flip side is that is seemingly getting harder and harder to do. And you hope it doesn't take the trauma of a 9/11 where 1,200 people are killed in a terrorist attack. You hope that that's not what it takes to remind ourselves, look, we can disagree, but as a nation, we need to come together to try to achieve some outcomes, both to help our security, our economic well-being, but as well as our friends and allies like Australia, as well as the broader world around us. Look, America has been blessed with a lot of advantages. The largest economy in the world. We have among the most powerful militaries in the world. We live in a nation that's blessed with resources. We're energy independent. We have water, we have food. We've been blessed with a lot of advantages. I'd like to see us use those advantages, not only to help ourselves, but to try to help others.
Admiral, I'm mindful that we're short on time, but I did put out a call this week to our viewers to say, what would you have us ask Mike Rogers, given the opportunity? And we've addressed a number of those issues about the different personalities, the loyalty that President Trump demanded, and others. Far and away, though, the most questions were around something that has kind of shifted in the consciousness in recent years, and that's UAPs, UFOs.
There you go.
The question they want, and one question in particular stands out to me, where they said, well, look, whether these UAPs that have been on Navy film and so on are explained by just a huge advance in technology from a rival nation, or something that the United States is developing, or something that is simply inexplicable. What is your perspective on that? Because we know that Congress has taken interest, certain members of Congress have spoken about this, and clearly a lot of people online, they see the videos, they see the stories.
This is a good conspiracy theory topic. It seems to energize a lot of people.
So what are your views on that? And what do you make of people's interest in that as a subject?
So first of all, I can still remember, this is probably back in 2016, 2015, when the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, calls me, Mike, I need you to go through all of it. I need the team to go through all of NSA's holding all of its files, and I need everything that you have on UFOs. And I'm like, what, sir? You want me to do a review of our databases on UFOs? And I'm literally thinking to myself, is this some kind of joke? But clearly it's not, which is reflected in the question. For a lot of people, this is, hey, what is going on out there? Look, clearly there are phenomena occurring out there that both are visible and that we can't explain. I don't know what causes them. I don't know what they are. I don't know why. I never saw anything in my experience in the government in 37 years, both as an intelligence professional, but also as a senior military individual. I never saw anything that led me to believe that there was some external, i.e. non-terrestrial actor behind this kind of activity. But the flip side is I couldn't explain some of the activity. I just don't know.
So it remains a mystery.
I think it does. But mysteries were meant to be solved over time.
I guess our viewers are going to be a little disappointed by that. But right. You've probably left
there
the
is
door
this
open
one
just
site
enough.
deeply buried.
Yeah, exactly.
You can only get access to it.
Yeah, exactly. All right then. I'll wrap it up on a serious note. Admiral Mike Rogers, thank you so much for taking a fireside chat with us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.